So this is the second lecture on Romanesque architecture. It's about Italian Romanesque architecture. And you probably thought, hey, he promised that we would see things that look Roman. And I don't know if we saw too many things like that. Ancient Roman, I mean. Instead, we saw a bunch of this stuff that looked like a horror movie. Well, when we get to the Italian Romanesque, you'll kind of see how they got this name. But even in the previous one, when we looked at the French one, the architecture did have some Roman qualities. So this one, as you can see from the first slide, we're looking at the cathedral complex at Pisa. We have some things I hope you already recognize as being pretty similar to what we saw in ancient Rome. So it helps to understand a little bit of the political and economic environment in Italy to understand how these things got built and the time frames for them. Italy was not what we call a united state or thought of as a country at this time, and it didn't actually become what it is today until the late 19th century. So at this time, it was a bunch of city-states, just like we saw in ancient Greece. And some of the city-states were monarchies, and some of them were republics. And when I say they're republics, I mean governments like the US supposedly has today. But like the US, you have the same sort of thing where technically you can vote and technically people have control. But in practice, there's fewer people that actually have control. So if you recognize a modern United States and how it works, then you'll recognize some of the same types of dynamics here. So people still do want to exercise power at this time, and it's not always coming from the people. So the Republic of Pisa is one of these republics, defeated Sicily, which was a kingdom, in 1062. And what they were fighting about is what they're always fighting about at this time, and it's trade in the Mediterranean. Remember in the Islamic lectures, in the Romanesque lecture, I talked about the Crusades. That was the same idea, trying to get control of Mediterranean trade and become a middleman, which is a very relatively easy and high-paying type of thing to do. So as a result of winning against Sicily, they were able to become a great trading power, and they used some of that money to go into this big complex. So again, they would want to have the church and all the priests and monks and nuns and all of that scholarship on their side. So the cathedral was built relatively quickly. You can see from 1063 into the 1100s. That's right there. And we're going to look at it a little bit more closely in a moment. The Baptistery is begun, and that's what this is, in 1153. And a baptistery is a building where Christians believe at this time, and then modern-day Catholics and some other Christians believe that a baby is born with original sin that we talked about before, and it's important for them to be baptized symbolically as Jesus was in the New Testament in the Bible. Some of these fancier cathedrals, big city cathedrals, they build a separate building for baptisms. And then the Campanile, which is the famous tower in the background. And as you can see in this picture, the tower is leaning really far to one side, but everything in this complex leans. It's just the tower is taller and skinnier, so it leans a little bit more. And part of the reason why this happened is because Pisa, like a lot of Italian port cities, is pretty close to pretty low elevation and right on the sea, basically. And that's pretty common for port cities to build up like that. And the ground in this particular area was very soft, which happens sometimes when you're near the sea. What they do nowadays when they have soft ground is they build foundations that are really solid. So if any of you are familiar with some of the projects in the United Arab Emirates, where they made, kind of man-made islands, and they had these very strong concrete foundations, and that was to flatten the ground and stop things from sinking that you build into it. At this time, they would do similar things if they needed to build on an area like this, especially if you're making out of a heavy stone, like these buildings are. They're made out of marble. So they knew at the time they had to do this, but they didn't bother doing it. So there was a little bit of a rush to put these buildings in, and probably not using the best engineering knowledge that was available to them at the time. The other thing you'll notice, and since the baptistry was begun in 1153, and there was some starts and stops over hundreds of years being built, it's very much in this Romanesque style, which we'll see in more detail in the cathedral and in the campanile, where you have these pretty simple arches like we saw in ancient Rome. But as it gets higher, it's because it's being built much later, it's more in the Gothic styles that we'll look at after this lecture. So that seems weird. You wouldn't normally see, a building started and 100 years later see it in a totally different style nowadays. But that was common for these buildings that sometimes took decades or even hundreds of years to build. So just like a lot of other things that we looked at, this is a complex. So you have the baptistry right here, the building we're looking at in the foreground, the campanile over here, and then the cathedral. And you see the cathedral's cruciform, just like the French ones we had looked at. So you can see how this is a development of the Basilica plan, and kind of like Nova Basilica, it has these round edges, but the inside is a little bit different than we saw in France. So not quite as advanced as far as the technology, but still very cool looking nonetheless. So the Pisa Cathedral, you can see the entire thing is faced with marble. Not a cheap thing to do, but certainly available in this area. And unlike the French churches, the Italian churches usually didn't have sculptures in their tympanums. Instead, they had paintings. And a lot of times they didn't have the same sorts of subjects. You would see like maybe a Last Judgment or a Christ enthroned. But at this time, there became an argument in the Catholic Church, and Italians and Catholics in Spain embraced this idea that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is not only a virgin, and that's miraculous that she gave birth to Jesus, but also that she was born without original sin. So she was like kind of a special person from the beginning. And she had kind of like a miraculous birth as well. And people in some other parts, especially, later on when people started to become Protestants, like a few hundred years after this, believed that they were trying to make Mary into a mother goddess. And that's a pretty good criticism, because in a way that's kind of what happened. But many people in Italy and in Spain really advocated to make Mary special. And make her into this almost like mother goddess figure. They would never say that that's what they were doing, but to kind of raise her importance close to that of Jesus. So you generally see, if you look very closely in this slide, you can see that there's Mary in this painting. In Italian cities, they call the big cathedrals, the ones that are supposed to be these displays of wealth and technology, the main cathedral for a town, they call it a Duomo. So if you ever visit Italy, that's what you'll see. It just means a main cathedral. So already we can see some of the Italian, we can see some of the ancient Roman type of influences. So this is almost like a revival of ancient Rome in a way, not just the technology, but also the form in this case. So we see these repetitive arches that are there. They're not needed necessarily for the structural purposes, but they do bring this big kind of slab of marble, which would be pretty boring, and we kind of saw in France, and brings it down to a human scale, makes it a little bit more interesting and lighter visually. When you put a bunch of holes in things, remember with the Pantheon, it tends to make it look lighter. But other than that, the form is fairly similar on the outside to what we saw in the French churches. This is it from the top. So there are some Byzantine and Islamic influences. So this type of dome, where it comes to a point, was something that was developed in the Byzantine and continued into the Islamic art that we looked at. We see an influence here. And this makes sense. Remember that Pisa is a port city, and they're trading in the Mediterranean, at the east of the Mediterranean, and then south into North Africa. there is Islamic cultures. So there would be a trade in items, but also we see a trade in influence, and that's pretty common to see this sort of thing. So a dome on a transept, not something that you would see in France, but due to the Islamic influence we see in Pisa. And then the arcade kind of continues throughout the complex. So these repetitive smaller elements tie everything together in a way. In the exterior, all white marble, so no expense was spared. It would certainly be more expensive nowadays than it was back then, though. And in this picture, you can see again with the baptistry that there is a bit of a lean to it. So that soft ground, things were sinking in unevenly. So the interior of the church is more like what we saw from the Ottonian churches, so before the Romanesque. So this style of having a flat wooden roof and having these pale and red voussoirs is something that you continue to see in Italy. It wasn't really till the Renaissance that they started to do some vaulted ceilings. We'll see one example a little bit later on. So there's a myriad of influences, which is what you would expect from a trading power between Asia, North Africa, and Europe. So ancient Rome is pretty close by to Pisa and was once part of the Roman Empire. This coffered ceiling. This is how the one would have looked, gilded in the Pantheon. But in this case, it's wood. The Byzantine, we see the apse mosaics. So mosaics are tiny stones that make pictures. So from the Byzantine. From the Islamic, we have these styles here of voussoirs and, these kind of repetitive arches, and also the elliptical dome. And then from the early Christian, it's the Basilica plan. So a basic Basilica plan with a flat wooden roof. Quite a bit fancier than the earlier churches, but not as much vaulting as you would see in a French one. So the baptistry, the lower half, is very Romanesque, as in it's relatively simple and it keeps these round arches. And then the upper half is more Gothic, where you have some round arches, but then you have some more points. And we'll see the technological reason for that when we look at French Gothic churches. But in this case, it's more of a stylistic element. Like they don't necessarily need to be pointed. It leans slightly in this picture, like the Campanile. I'm guessing right here in the foreground is an American tourist. It doesn't look very Italian. They like to dress pretty well. And you see that throughout. It's a rotunda plan, which is kind of similar to what we're talking about in the Pantheon. That's a rotunda plan. But what they were going for was the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So a trading power, they want to connect themselves to Jerusalem. And at this time, again, some people in Europe are trying to occupy Jerusalem. Again, giving this kind of religious reason, but more for trading purposes. So this is the inside of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. If that looks a lot like the Pantheon, that's because that's what that was influenced by. So you're seeing this Roman influence come through another influence. So the Pisa, why is it lean? We already talked about the soft ground, but it actually leans in a stranger way because what they did as they were building it to kind of stop it from falling over, more or less. This writing is really small, but basically it talks about the hundreds of years that it took to build this thing. And Pisa, during this time, they had to fight some wars and they ran out of money and had to put money in that, so they would just stop and then continue it later. And once they got to a certain level, they started to build one side higher than the other, and they thought that that would get it to lean back the other way, which totally worked. Unfortunately, it leaned too far. So the Tower of Pisa used to lean to the left in this picture, and now it leans to the right. But that's why it's got a bit of a banana shape, which you can really notice if you see the whole thing. So one side, this side, is a little bit higher than the other. And as they started to get to the top, they noticed it was leaning back again. They're like, we should probably stop, but nah. And they don't. And they build it to the top. And they put some big, giant, heavy bells in there. So over the hundreds of years, it started to lean farther and farther. And in the 19th century, scientists building engineers were becoming really concerned the thing was going to fall over. It's not as strong as modern buildings. Solid stone will tend to come apart. Modern buildings will have like steel on the inside, or they'll have concrete that's on these long tubes. So that's a lot stronger and more flexible. This type of construction, not so flexible. So if you start to get cracks, eventually it's going to fall. And it's really easy to figure out how it would fall too, because we saw an example on 9/11, 2001, when the Twin Towers were hit by airplanes. These fires caused it to lose structural integrity. And even though they seem tall and skinny, and you would think they would just like kind of topple over to the side, they don't. They fall right into themselves. And the reason why is because they're heavy. And gravity is going to bring it downwards. It wouldn't be able to fall all the way over because it's not structurally strong enough to be able to do that. So if the Pisa Tower had collapsed, it would have done the same thing. It would have just fallen into itself because of its weight. So they began to get concerned. And in the 20th century, they said, okay, when it goes past 5 degrees, 5.5 degrees, we're in trouble. And it's going to fall. And it kept leaning and it didn't fall. They had taken the bells out of it, tried to reduce all of the weight at the top. They did some other things to kind of shore it up. And somehow it was still standing. But by 1990, they were super concerned. You can see it's 5.5 degrees, far beyond what they thought would make it collapse. So they started something they had already been planning for a while, this restoration to get it leaning back a little bit farther and to stabilize the building. So they did it in some ways that seem very crude and not so high tech, and then other ways that were as high tech as was available at the time. So some of the crude non-high tech ways were they took a bunch of lead weights and put it on one side so that when they started to do the high tech things, that it would lean back the way they wanted to. And then they took these super high strength cables and bands and put them around the building. And you can see there's a map of how they attached it so that it would stay stable when it leans over, because it might want to crack when you're slowly moving it back. And then it would fall into itself again. They didn't want that to happen. So this was to kind of stabilize the building. And then the high-tech part was kind of amazing. It was really on the leading edge of innovation at this time. It's a drill that's guided by lasers, and nobody controls it. What people would do is get a three-dimensional map of the lay of the land, then program into a computer exactly three-dimensionally how much dirt you wanted to remove, and then do a bunch of simulations with software to get exactly what they wanted and to keep the building stable. So then finally they built up that plan, used the drill, took out the dirt they needed. The building went back a little bit, and it remained stable. And it's believed that it will be stable for a few centuries with no further things needed to be done. So they can see how they kind of created some foundations to be able to keep it stable. What they should have done in the first place and they could have done wasn't beyond their technology. So you're probably wondering, like, why wouldn't they just straighten the thing up? Well, the first thing, if they straightened it up, it would still look kind of bent. But the other thing is that there's quite a few campaniles in Italy and in other cities in Greece and in Eastern Europe and such. And they're cool, but this one leans. And modern day Italy, although it has like a lot of technology in their economy, and obviously things like fashion that you're probably aware of, but tourism is a big part of their economy. So leaving the lean in there so people are still visiting this leaning tower of Pisa ensures that they can get the tourists that they need to come in. The other thing they did after I fixed it is they allowed people to walk up to the top again. And it's like pretty hard, I hear, even if you're in pretty good shape. There's a lot of steps that are going up there. and it's no joke, but it's cool. You can go up there nowadays and see this tower. So I'll post a video that kind of talks a little bit about the issues in more detail. It's a short video, but it'll tell you about how they fixed the tower.